In the high desert of Nevada, time can feel like it is standing still. But in July 1996, for one man, it may have literally fractured. In the small, isolated town of Rachel, Nevada, an event occurred that remains unexplained to this day. A local farmer, Donald Curtis, vanished from his ranch after a blinding flash of light was seen over his field. He would not be seen again for 2 years. When he returned, he looked almost unchanged, and for him, only a minute had passed. On his body were fresh traces of a complex surgery he had no memory of. The authorities would eventually classify every file on the case, but the people who lived there, the few who saw what happened, remember every single detail of that night. Rachel, Nevada, is barely a town. In 1996, its population hovered at just 54 people. It exists as a lonely outpost on Highway 375, a stretch of asphalt so notorious for strange sightings, it is officially known as the Alien Highway. The nearest major city, Las Vegas, is 150 kilometers to the south, but it feels a world away. Surrounding Rachel is nothing but endless desert, stark mountains, and a few scattered ranches. Just 20 miles to the south, a line is drawn in the sand, the border of the restricted military zone known as Area 51. The residents of Rachel were, by necessity, accustomed to the unusual. The sonic boom of experimental aircraft was a common interruption, and strange lights or noises in the night were often just dismissed as the military. Donald Curtis was one of those residents. His ranch was located 7 miles east of Rachel, a quiet life for a quiet man. He was 49 years old and had lived alone since his divorce. His neighbors described him as reserved, but utterly reliable. You could set your watch by his habits. Every single morning, he drove his 1992 pickup into town to get his mail and supplies. His truck was always parked in the exact same spot outside the general store. Curtis ran about 200 head of cattle and grew alfalfa on several plots. His property nestled in a shallow valley between low, red sandstone hills. He was a simple man until his life collided with the impossible on the night of July 23, 1996. It was late, around 11 p.m., when at least 3 residents saw the light. Martha Griffin, the owner of the local snack bar, was standing on her porch for a final cigarette before bed. Her home was about 4 miles from Curtis's property. She saw a silvery white glow suddenly ignite on the horizon, hanging silently and motionless right over Curtis's ranch. It was not a flare. It was not a spotlight. It was intensely bright, far brighter than anything she had ever seen. She yelled for her husband, but in the few seconds it took him to get to the door, the light just went out, as if a switch had been thrown. The entire event lasted no more than 30 seconds. At that same moment, a truck driver named Kevin Jennings was heading west on Highway 375. He saw the same light off to his right. He later described it as looking like a welding flash, only magnified hundreds of times. It hung in the air, a silent tear of white fire, and then vanished. Jennings, used to strange sights on this road, slowed his rig, scanned the dark desert, and seeing nothing else, figured it was military business and drove on. The next morning, July 24th, Donald Curtis never arrived in town. Martha Griffin at the diner was the first to notice. Curtis always showed up for his morning coffee. Between 8 and 9 a.m., she called his house. There was no answer. By noon, a knot of worry had formed. Martha asked her nephew, Tyler, to drive out to the ranch and check on him. Tyler arrived around 2:00 in the afternoon. The main gate was open. He drove the dirt road to Curtis's house, but found no one there. The door was locked. Tyler walked around the property, calling Curtis's name. Then he saw it. Out in the middle of a pasture, about half a mile from the house, sat Curtis's pickup truck. Tyler drove his own car out to it. The scene was eerie, frozen in a moment of panic. The pickup's headlights were on, the battery completely dead. The driver's side door was wide open. The keys were still in the ignition. On the passenger seat sat a flashlight and an empty coffee can. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no indication of what had happened. Just an empty truck in an empty field. But as Tyler looked around, he saw something else. The ground around the truck was scarred. 3 perfect circles, each 15 to 20 feet in diameter, were burned black into the dry grass, spaced about 10 yards apart from each other. The ground inside them was scorched. Tyler walked to the center of the nearest circle and crouched down. The sand there had been subjected to an intense, focused heat. It had melted and fused together. Tyler touched it. It was hard, smooth and black. It felt like glass. Tyler did not hesitate. He jumped in his car, raced back to Rachel, and immediately reported what he had found to the Lincoln County Sheriff. By 5:00 p.m., 2 Lincoln County deputy sheriffs had arrived at the ranch. They examined the site, their boots crunching on the dry grass as they walked the perimeter of the 3 bizarre circles. They photographed everything: the scorched earth, the pickup truck still standing with its door agape, and the strange, glassy sand at the center of the burns. One of the deputies, a man who had worked this county for 20 years, admitted he would never seen anything like it. Believing that all the strange occurrences in these parts were somehow connected to Area 51, he attempted to contact the military base. He was looking for answers, or at least a denial. He got neither. Just silence. There was no official response from the military. The next day, a full-scale search began. This was a small community, and one of their own was missing. Volunteers from Rachel and neighboring towns, more than 30 people in all, combed the vast, unforgiving area around Curtis's ranch on foot and in 4x4s. They brought in search dogs, hoping they could pick up a trail. But a new layer of strangeness was added to the mystery. The dogs tracked Curtis's scent from the house to the pasture, but as soon as they neared the burned circles, they stopped. They lost the trail completely, as if it had been severed from the earth. The animals began to whine, tucking their tails, their fur on end. One of the best tracking hounds in the group lay down on the ground, whimpering, and refused to move. She had to be physically carried back to a vehicle. The search continued for 2 grueling weeks under the brutal Nevada sun. During that time, military helicopters were seen flying over the area. These were not the standard issue helicopters residents sometimes saw. They were unmarked, dark, and they flew low. Residents of Rachel saw them hovering directly over Curtis's ranch, circling the burned areas with methodical precision. Once, a helicopter landed right in the field. People in full, white protective suits disembarked and began taking soil samples, placing them in sealed containers. Local authorities received no information about this visit. The military was operating on its own, ignoring local law enforcement. By mid-August 1996, with no leads and no body, the official search was called off. The case was classified as missing. The official version, the one that went into the file, was that Donald Curtis, a man who had lived his entire life in the desert, had likely gotten lost, suffered from heat stroke, and died somewhere in a remote canyon. His body, the report concluded, was probably taken by coyotes. His family, an ex-wife and a daughter from California, came to Rachel. They quietly took his personal belongings, locked the doors to the house, and left. The ranch was put up for sale. In September, the property was purchased by a couple from Arizona, Jeffrey and Elizabeth Moran. They were horse breeders looking for inexpensive land, and the story of Curtis's disappearance, while strange, did not bother them. They were practical people. They moved into the house in October 1996 and began the hard work of settling in. Jeffrey Moran later said that the first few months were completely uneventful. They repaired the horse pens, brought in shipments of feed, and updated the old wiring in the house. The only thing that bothered them was the strange behavior of their animals. At night, the horses would become nervous for no apparent reason, kicking the stall doors. Sometimes, they flat out refused to leave their stalls after sunset. A few times, Elizabeth was sure she heard a low, resonant humming sound, a vibration that seemed to come from somewhere deep underground. Jeffrey attributed it to heavy military equipment operating in the distance, out in the restricted zone. Then, in the spring of 1997, minor oddities began to escalate. Jeffrey discovered that several heavy wooden fence posts had been torn clean out of the ground, yet there were no traces of machinery or animal tracks anywhere near them. Then one morning, he found a dead cow at the far edge of his property. The animal was lying on its side. There were no visible wounds, no bullet holes, no predator marks, but it was completely, impossibly drained of blood. The veterinarian he called out was baffled and could not determine a cause of death. Jeffrey, unnerved, buried the cow and decided never to speak of the incident again. A year passed and then another. Life in Rachel went on. The name Donald Curtis was mentioned less and less. The burnt circles in the field gradually became overgrown with new grass, though the soil there remained darker, a permanent stain on the land. On August 15, 1998, exactly 2 years and 23 days after Donald Curtis vanished, Elizabeth Moran woke up around 5:00 in the morning. A noise from the porch had startled her, a faint creak, like a footstep on the old wood. She shook her husband awake. Jeffrey grabbed his rifle, kept by the bed for coyotes, and slipped out of the bedroom. The house was dark and still. He moved into the hallway and turned on the light, squinting into the sudden brightness. As he did, he saw the front door slowly, hesitantly pushing open. A man was standing on the threshold, silhouetted against the pre-dawn gray. He was wearing dirty clothes and looked utterly disoriented, his eyes wide as he looked around, as if he could not understand where he was. Jeffrey raised the rifle, his voice firm. "Who are you?" The man blinked, as if stunned by the light. He looked past Jeffrey into the living room, his face a mask of confusion. This is my house," the man replied, his voice raspy. "Who are you?" Elizabeth had followed her husband and was peering from behind him. She moved closer, scrutinizing the stranger's gaunt face. Then she grabbed her husband's arm and whispered, "Jeffrey, I think it is Curtis." Jeffrey did not lower the gun, but he took a half step back. Elizabeth reached for the main living room light switch. As the room flooded with light, the man flinched and covered his eyes with his hand, as if the light was physically painful. He was wearing a faded plaid shirt and jeans, his work boots caked with dried mud. His face was thin, covered in several days' worth of stubble. He looked to be about 50 years old, tired and weathered, but otherwise unharmed. Jeffrey, keeping the rifle ready, told him to sit in a chair by the door. Elizabeth went to the phone and called the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office. The dispatcher, sounding sleepy, said the nearest patrol was 40 minutes away in Caliente. She stressed that they needed to come as soon as possible. Curtis sat stiffly in the chair, his gaze wandering over the walls, the new furniture, the photographs on the shelves that were not his. He kept repeating, almost to himself, "I do not understand. I just went outside." Jeffrey, trying to make sense of the situation, asked him where he had come from. Curtis looked at him, his eyes struggling to focus. He said he had been in his field, he would seen a light, and he would decided to walk closer to get a better look. He spoke slowly, pausing for long seconds, as if trying to pull the words from a deep fog. Elizabeth, seeing his condition, brought him a glass of water. Curtis drank it in one gulp and asked for more. She poured another. He drank 3 full glasses, one after the other, his hands shaking slightly. Jeffrey knelt down slightly, trying to get his attention. "Mr. Curtis, do you know what day it is?" Curtis thought for a moment, frowning. "It is July 23rd, 96. Elizabeth and Jeffrey exchanged a look of disbelief. Jeffrey took a slow breath. "No," he said gently. "It is August 15th, 1998. Curtis just stared at him, then shook his head. "That is impossible. I left a few minutes ago. Half an hour, at most." His breathing quickened. He was getting nervous, agitated. He stood up from a chair and walked over to the window, pushing the curtain aside. It was starting to get light outside. He looked out at the pasture, at the new horse pens that had not been there before. He turned around and looked at the Morans, his eyes narrowed. "Who are you? Why are you in my house?" Jeffrey explained it all again, slowly. That he had bought the ranch in September of 1996, after Curtis had disappeared. That he had been missing for over 2 years. That he had, in fact, been officially declared dead. Curtis turned pale, a sickly white. He stumbled back to the chair and sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands. 45 minutes later, 2 deputy sheriffs arrived. One of them, an older man named Russell, had been part of the original search. He stopped in the doorway, his jaw slack. He stood silently for a few seconds and then asked the question everyone was thinking. "Don, where in the hell have you been all this time?" Curtis raised his head, his eyes hollow. "I do not know," he whispered. "I do not remember anything." He was taken to the sheriff's office in Caliente, 37 miles south of Rachel. There he was formally questioned, and he repeated the same impossible story. He went out on the evening of July 23, 1996, after seeing a bright light above his field. He remembered walking through the tall, dry grass toward that silent, silvery, white glow. And then, a feeling. He felt an intense, crushing pressure, as if the air around him had suddenly become dense, almost liquid. He could not move. He tried to scream, but he could not even draw a breath. Then, everything went white. The next thing he knew, he was waking up on his own doorstep in the dark. It felt like only a few minutes had passed. He was asked if he would seen anyone or heard any voices. Curtis said no. Only the white light and that terrible, paralyzing pressure. Nothing else. One of the deputies asked the obvious question. Had he been drinking or using drugs that night? Curtis, a man known for his rigid habits, flatly denied it. He was taken to a doctor at a small local clinic in Caliente for an examination. Curtis's physical condition was, all things considered, satisfactory. The doctor noted signs of mild dehydration, but his weight was normal, and there were no external signs of injury, exposure, or trauma. The story seemed to be hitting a dead end, until the doctor asked Curtis to lift his shirt. There, on his left side, just in the lower rib area, was a fresh, neat surgical suture, about 5 inches long. The skin around it was not inflamed, and it was healing cleanly. The doctor asked Curtis when he would have the operation. Curtis looked down at the suture as if seeing it for the first time. His face went blank with a new, dawning horror. He had no idea where it had come from. The doctor, now deeply concerned, stated that it was a professionally done surgical suture. Judging by its condition, the operation had been performed at most a week ago. There were no other marks, no traces of catheters, drains, or other standard medical procedures. The scar was the only thing. Curtis insisted, his voice rising, that he had never had any operations, never seen any surgeons. He was immediately sent for a more thorough examination at the hospital in Ely, 80 miles to the north. There, he underwent x-rays, blood tests, and urine tests. The results provided the stunning, impossible climax to his story. The x-rays and subsequent analysis showed that Donald Curtis was missing his left kidney. The hospital surgeons confirmed the clinic doctor's suspicion. The operation was a standard nephrectomy, performed recently and cleanly with professional skill. The organ had been removed without complications. But there were no records of this operation anywhere. Curtis, who had no memory of the event, could not explain where or when his kidney had been removed. Doctors, grasping for a rational explanation, suspected amnesia caused by trauma or stress. But physically, Curtis was perfectly healthy, apart from the inexplicable and recent absence of one of his vital organs. News of Curtis's reappearance and his bizarre medical condition tore through the small county. It was the only thing anyone in Rachel talked about. Martha Griffin, the diner owner who had first noticed him missing, drove to Caliente to see him with her own eyes. She confirmed it was him, the same Donald Curtis, just looking a little more tired, a little more haunted. The news even reached his ex-wife in California. She called the sheriff's office, not in relief, but in suspicion, asking that psychiatrists examine her ex-husband. She believed he was suffering from a mental disorder. Curtis, however, refused any psychiatric evaluation. He claimed he felt fine and just wanted to go home. But he no longer had a home. The ranch legally belonged to the Moran family. All the documents had been processed by the court after Curtis was declared dead. Returning the property was a legal impossibility. Curtis was offered temporary accommodation in a motel in Caliente, paid for by the county. He spent 3 days there, a man at a time, while journalists from Las Vegas and Reno began to swarm the small town. The county sheriff, in a protective move, prohibited the press from accessing Curtis and asked him not to give interviews. Curtis, lost in his own fog, agreed. On August 19th, for days after his reappearance, 2 men in dark civilian clothes drove up to the motel. They showed their IDs to the owner, introducing themselves as Air Force security personnel. They asked to meet with Curtis. The motel owner nervously called the sheriff's office, but Deputy Russell said there was nothing he could do. The military had the right to conduct the interview. The men spent about 2 hours in the room with Curtis. What they discussed is unknown. When they left, Curtis, who was already withdrawn, looked completely depressed, almost broken. That evening, he bought a one-way bus ticket to Las Vegas. He would never return to Rachel. A week after his departure, a new team arrived at the Moran Ranch. This time, there were more of them, about 10 people, arriving in an unmarked truck with sophisticated equipment. When Jeffrey Moran demanded to know what they were doing, one of them showed a document with the seal of the Department of Defense and said they were conducting routine monitoring of radiation levels. They cordoned off the field with yellow tape. The team worked for 2 days. Elizabeth Moran watched them dig several deep holes, precisely where the original burn circles had been. They took soil and well water samples, then filled in the holes and compacted the soil, erasing the last physical evidence. No report was ever provided to the Morans. The final nail was hammered into the coffin in September 1998. The Lincoln County Sheriff's Office received an official letter from the Air Force Department. It demanded that all materials related to the Donald Curtis case, all reports, interrogation notes, medical files, and the original photographs of the circles be transferred to their archives, and that access to them be permanently restricted. No reason was given. The case was, in effect, classified. Attempts by journalists to file for access to the information were dismissed by a court, citing national security. Donald Curtis was gone, and the official file on his case was buried, but the phenomenon itself did not leave with him. In the winter of 1998, strange and unsettling new things began to happen at the Moran Ranch. The property, it seemed, was permanently marked. Jeffrey woke up several times in the dead of night to a violent commotion. All the horses in the corral would suddenly begin to neigh in terror, banging their bodies against the walls of their stalls, as if trying to escape an invisible predator. Jeffrey would grab his flashlight and rifle, run outside, and find nothing. The air would be cold, still, and silent. The animals would eventually calm down, but the next morning they would be exhausted, their coats slick with sweat. Elizabeth complained about constant, maddening problems with the electricity. The lights in the house would go out for no reason, plunging them into darkness, only to flicker back on by themselves minutes later. One evening, every single light bulb in the house burned out simultaneously with a loud pop, showering the rooms in darkness and the smell of ozone. An electrician from Caliente inspected the wiring, the breaker box and the transformer, but found no faults. He said it was as if the house had been hit by a massive power surge, yet nothing else in the area was affected. In January 1999, one of the Moran's few neighbors, a farmer named Gary Holmes, who lived 6 miles to the north, reported a strange incident to the sheriff. He was driving home late at night when he saw the exact same bright, silvery white light that Martha Griffin had described 2.5 years earlier. It was hanging motionless and silent, directly over the former Curtis Ranch. It held there for about a minute, an unnatural star, and then instantly vanished. Holmes, shaken, stopped his truck and waited, but nothing else happened. He called Jeffrey Moran the next morning, who confirmed he had not seen the light but would check the area. Jeffrey rode his ATV around the entire field. He did not find any new burn circles. But in the same pasture where Curtis's truck had been found, the grass was flattened in a perfect 30-foot diameter circle, as if something immense had pressed down on it from above. Jeffrey, fearing another military quarantine, did not report this to the authorities. Elizabeth insisted they sell the ranch, but there were no buyers. Everyone in the county now knew the history of that land. The strangeness began to spread. In February, the small independent radio station in Rachel suddenly stopped working. The owner, an elderly man who broadcast local news, said his equipment had malfunctioned due to severe, high-frequency interference. The interference appeared from nowhere, lasted for about an hour, and then disappeared, leaving his expensive transmitter completely fried. Several other Rachel residents reported that their radios and televisions had broken down during those same days. Some heard a strange, low-frequency hum coming from their speakers, even when the devices were turned off. Martha Griffin, the diner owner, began to meticulously record all the strange events occurring in and around Rachel after Curtis's return. By the spring of 1999, her private log had more than 20 entries. Meanwhile, Donald Curtis was living a phantom life in Las Vegas. In the spring of 1999, he was found by an independent researcher of anomalous phenomena from California. The researcher, sensing Curtis was a man with nothing left to lose, suggested he undergo a session of regressive hypnosis to try and recover his memory of the missing 2 years. Curtis, perhaps desperate for his own answers, agreed. The session took place in a private clinic, and the results were never published. The researcher would later tell an associate only one thing: what he remembers should not be made public, for his sake and for ours. In the summer of 1999, Donald Curtis disappeared again. The owner of the warehouse complex where he worked as a night guard reported to the police that Curtis had not shown up for his shift and was not answering his phone. The police checked his small apartment. It was empty. All his belongings were there, as were his documents and wallet. Only the man was missing. This time, no one organized a search. The case was quietly closed a month later. Some in Rachel believe he was taken again. Others think he was silenced. The Moran Ranch finally sold in 2001 for a fraction of its value. The new owner, an investor, never built on it. The land remains vacant to this day. The story of Donald Curtis is one of the most mysterious in Lincoln County history. Officially, it does not exist. The documents are classified. The witnesses are silent. But the facts remain. A man lost 2 years in an instant, returned with a missing organ, and was erased by forces that continue to watch the skies over the alien highway.